Hello and welcome. You're watching NDTV 24/7. I'm Osama Shaab. Tonight on Left, Right and Centre, a united Brics front. After Donald Trump shuts the door on trade talks with India and turns up the heat with tariffs, Beijing calls him a bully. Brazil's Lula da Silva, he chats with Prime Minister Modi, and Moscow's Vladimir Putin is on the line too. Is the world's fastest growing economy about to pivot away from Washington or play the power game to its advantage? We'll try and break down what it means and what India's next move could be. Like I said, Trump says no more trade talks with India and slaps on more tariffs. China's calling him a bully. Brazil's President Lula is chatting with Prime Minister Modi, and even Putin's picking up the phone. Is this the start of a Brics pushback? And what cards does India have to play? We'll try and find answers to some of those questions, but before that, take a look at this report.
Trump has left the building. Over.
We can now project the winner of the presidential race. Donald Trump wins the presidency.
What started off as unlikely, impossible, is now reality.
A tariff tantrum from the Oval Office. 50% duties on India, accusing New Delhi of supporting the Russian war machine. President Trump's latest America First salvo. With shockwaves across the world, the global south was amongst the hardest hit. And India is caught in the middle of a high-stakes diplomatic balancing act. Despite India's calm yet resolute response, remaining open to negotiations to reach a trade deal, President Trump made his position clear. No more talks until he gets what he wants.
Just to follow up on the India tariffs, do you expect increased trade negotiations, since you've announced the 50% tariff?
No, not until we get it resolved.
New Delhi is not taking this lightly. Already 3 steps ahead of Washington. Amid Trump's tariff tirade, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval was in Moscow, shoring up ties with Moscow, a message as clear as day. New Delhi's old friendships are going nowhere. Next move, Beijing. Prime Minister Modi is expected to visit China this month. Putting aside their differences, the two Asian giants will navigate between competition and the need for a united front against bully Washington. Brazilian President Lula, also facing the heat of Washington's tariffs, backed India, calling out Trump's tariff pressure in a call with PM Modi. Coming together, the Brics bloc led by Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa are pushing back on President Trump's tariff tantrums. In the Brics corridors, the message is blunt. They will not tolerate such bullying and are now mapping new routes to bypass Washington's chokehold. Within this diplomatic dance lies India, determined not to choose sides in the never-ending US-Russia competition, protecting access to US markets while boosting ties with Russia, China and Brazil. In this balancing act, one misstep could mean disaster.
All right, we have a fantastic panel of guests joining us on the broadcast at this moment. I have Robert Moran, commentator and author, partner at Brunswick Group. I also have Professor Steve Hanke, a professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins. Michael Kugelman also joins us, senior fellow, Asia Pacific Foundation, South Asia columnist, and also Mark Linscott, who's joining us. He is a senior advisor, U.S. India Strategic Ties Forum. Robert Moran, let me come to you first. When you talk about this relationship and how things have developed in the last couple of weeks, critics say that Trump's trade tactics, they're less about economics and more about political theater for his base. Is that a fair assessment? What do you think?
I don't think that is a fair assessment. I think it's more complex. I think there's some truth, but I think the following. Number one is the president has believed that the United States has been getting an unfair deal in trade for a very, very long time. So he's been consistent on this, which is one of the few things that he seems to really have a consistent ideology around. And he was talking about this in the 1980s. So that's number one. Number two is him and his team do truly appear to believe that some level of managed trade is better than free trade. Number three is they clearly believe that they need to reset the terms of trade in a bilateral manner. And so I think all those things are true. And that's what they're attempting to do. I think that the president has a very standard pattern. He uses his communication as a way to push for a better deal. And if he has to walk back something or change direction, he does. But that's, I think, the phase we're looking at now. And I imagine that there'll be much back and forth before some final arrangement is agreed upon.
Robert, I also want to understand this new dynamics that is in play, especially with the BRICS nation coming together. If India strengthens its ties with BRICS, within BRICS, what real leverage does Washington still have over New Delhi?
This is a great question. I mean, the question assumes that the BRICS are a unit of analysis. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that. That there are individual countries that have their own paths and their own needs. And so, for example, at a certain core level, India will choose its own path based on what they want, not what the BRICS want. And so, there's a trade, about 130 billion of trade between the U.S. and India. And the U.S. is India's largest trading partner. And India has about a $40 billion trade surplus a year, which is not big compared to many of the other countries we're talking about. So yeah. I think that ultimately Indian decision makers will be thinking about U.S. and India trade as opposed to the BRICS, which is a much larger concept and not a military alliance.
Having said that, do you see the possibility of say, for example, a Trump 2.0 recalibrating his stance towards India? Or is this a long-term hardening of position by Donald Trump and U.S.?
Well, I actually think that independent of who is the occupant of the White House, that American foreign policy would be focused on attempting to have much closer ties with India over the long run, which would be very important to the United States relative to China. And so I assume that in the long run, the U.S. and India are much more compatible trading partners, and that the U.S. will want favorable ties and cooperation with India.
All right, Robert Moran, thank you very much for sharing your views on this rather developing situation, and we'll keep a close eye on how things unfold from here. In fact, I'll request all the other guests to stay put, because I'm also joined by Meera Shankar, the former ambassador of India to the United States of America. Ambassador Shankar, welcome to NDTV. You have seen Washington up close. Is this simply Trump's negotiating style, or is the relationship with India at a risk of a deeper rupture here?
Well, I would not write off the relationship just yet. There are many factors which bring the two countries together. It's just that for Trump, those other factors are not important. He does not take a strategic view of relationships. He takes a very transactional view of relationships. And for the moment, what is uppermost in his mind is the negotiation with Russia over Ukraine. He had promised his MAGA constituency and the country that he would have a ceasefire in Ukraine in 24 hours. That has not happened. He's finding Putin is a harder nut to crack than he had initially thought, and that the positions of both Russia and Ukraine on how the conflict should resolve are very wide apart indeed. So I think it's the frustration on that account that he is pressurizing India with tariffs on energy purchases from Russia in the hope that somehow or the other, either, India will stop purchasing and therefore Russia will, find itself with a reduced bank account to actually fund the war, or that somehow India will talk to Russia and Russia will be more amenable to negotiations.
Yeah.
So whatever it is, for Trump at the moment, it's the end game in the Ukraine conflict, which is determining how he's treating the issue of energy purchases by India from Russia.
Yeah.
The other tariffs, of course, are part of his longer, wider approach to putting tariffs on all countries. But at the moment, he's still discussing with China, which has, one of the largest trade surpluses with the U.S.
Yeah.
India is something like the 10th largest trading partner. And our surplus has been in the region of $20 to $30 billion a year.
Yeah.
This year, it's over 40 billion. But that's really peanuts compared to the kind of deficits that the U.S. has with many other countries.
Ambassador Shankar, I also want to understand this outreach from countries like China, from countries like Brazil and Russia. How should New Delhi interpret this outreach? Is it, should they interpret it as solidarity or as a subtle push to pull India into their orbit? Because in that very case, there is a risk that India might get alienated from the Western market.
Well, I think India has to play this quite coolly and carefully. I don't think it wants to join an anti-US bloc, if you will. It doesn't want to constitute an anti-US bloc. But at the same time, when the US, so blithely, completely tramples on India's sensitivities and also creates hurdles for its economic growth, India will also obviously discuss these issues with other countries who may be seeking a better balance in global forums and, more multilateral world, if you will. So I think that India will not seek a confrontation with the US, and nor should it, just buckle over. I think it has to be smart. It can continue discussing, and it should use its own strengths as well. Perhaps you don't retaliate immediately, but you can prepare a list of goods on which you could potentially retaliate, which can be published, and, say that this depends on how talks go.
Yeah. Ambassador Shankar, and this is a very obvious question because India has had that position. Do you think India can realistically play both the sides, as in deepening the Brics ties while also keeping the US on side? Or is there a choice? Is a choice inevitable for India?
I don't think so. I don't think for India it would be a good thing to choose either.
Yeah.
Because the world is far more complex. And as we've seen, relationships can turn depending on internal political developments in the great past. I mean, the US-India relationship was on very solid ground. And yet, within a couple of months, it's come under so much pressure that, you do need to create space. You cannot afford, as a large developing country, which has multifarious interests, from development to security to peace to better balance in Asia to, ensuring that global forums better reflect the realities of the world of today and give more voice to developing countries. There are so many interests, and in some cases, your interests coincide with one country, and in other cases, they may coincide with other countries. And I think India cannot accept that it will not have the flexibility and the freedom to make its own choices. After all, what is the Ukraine war about?
Yeah.
You know, the West has basically, because Putin was arguing for a long time with the West, that Ukrainian neutrality should be reestablished and there should be no NATO membership for Ukraine, and that this should be legally binding. The West didn't agree, and they, in fact, espoused the principle that every country has a right to choose its own policies.
Yeah.
Well, doesn't that apply to India?
Well, it is an ever-changing situation, and we, Ambassador, we might just be having, Ambassador Shankar, we might just be having a very different conversation going forward in a couple of days from now.
You know, I would also say that much will depend on how the meeting between Trump and Putin goes, how the negotiations of Ukraine proceed, as far as the energy sanctions are concerned. For the other sanctions, I think it's going to be a little tougher to deal with, but the energy sanctions really depend on how the negotiations with Russia on halting and ending the military conflict in Ukraine will go.
All right, Ambassador Shankar, thank you very much for sharing your views and speaking to NDTV. Meanwhile, we are also joined by Professor Steve Hanke, a professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins. Professor Hanke, welcome to NDTV. Given Trump's refusal to engage in further trade talks with India, how should India recalibrate its trade strategy in order to minimize economic fallout?
Well, I think the main thing is to follow Napoleon's advice. And I'll quote here Napoleon Bonaparte. He said, never interfere with an enemy in the process of destroying himself. And I think Trump is destroying himself. So in the case of India, I think Modi and Jaishankar, the foreign minister, should just keep their cards close to their chest and wait for a little while. And the reason I say that is that I think Trump's house of cards will collapse is that the economic premise for tariffs rests on quicksand. The premise is that trade deficits in the United States are caused by foreigners and they're bad. No, they're caused by Americans spending more than the gross national product produced in the United States, and as a result, we have a trade deficit. It's a simple accounting identity in economics. So the economics is just all wrong, rubbish. Trump's tariff economics is absolutely rubbish.
You know, when we speak about the Brics coordination, the result of this, and as you've also mentioned, countries like Russia, China, and even the Brazilian president, Lula, he reached out to India. How do you see this? Is India at a risk of getting isolated from the Western markets? How do you look at it, sir?
Well, I don't think that's the case. Why not have it as free a trade and commerce within Brics as possible, and in addition, trade with the Western countries as these new rules are set. Maybe they aren't free trade, but you still can do some trade. So I think this pivoting into Brics is just a natural thing. And the problem with Brics is that they talk a lot, but they don't have really any concrete game plan. So in that regard, Brics has a long way to go. They don't have they don't have the big problem with Brics. They don't have a concrete game plan and framework for doing things. I mean, for example, they want to set up a commodity market, but it's something I know a lot about, and they have no plan. Brics is the kind of organization, it has no plan, and I don't think it knows what the word plan means. It's a talk shop. They talk, they get together and talk, but they don't do anything in a concrete way. Now maybe they'll be motivated to come together with concrete plans and actions as they're being attacked by Trump. If you're being attacked, what happens? Well, if you're smart, you circle the wagons and fortify your defenses and plan also for a counterattack. Now, China, in this regard, China is actually the smart one. Let's move away from Brics and India and Russia and so forth. China is the one who is the country who seems to know what it's doing, and they actually have an ace up their sleeve because they control many critical materials. They could shut the U.S. economy down in a matter of about 6 to 9 months. China could, and Trump has finally figured that out, and that's why. Why do you think Trump is backing off of his trade war with China? It's because he's figured out that China does have an ace up its sleeve. All these critical materials that it controls and leads the world in. The three M's: mining, metallurgy, and material science. China leads. It's number one.
Having said that, Professor Hankey, is it possible for India to remain strategically non-aligned while actively engaging in a more consolidated Brics economic bloc? What do you think?
I think they should stay as neutral as possible, and I think Josh Hankar is the man. He's the brains. He's one of the. He's one of the. I think there are 3 foreign ministers who are actually top rate right now, and one happens to be Josh Hankar. The other one is, of course, the top one is Lavrov in Russia, and the third is the foreign minister of China. So it's very interesting. You see, we come back to that phalanx of those 3 countries, Russia, China, and India. They have the smartest foreign ministers of any other countries. The top 3 are those. So I think that India has the right man leading the foreign ministry, and I think the right man to keep number one in the interest of India is number one. He knows that, but he also knows how to maneuver. He's an experienced guy who's got a head on his shoulders, and I think neutrality is the place to be. Why not be on both sides? Okay. Why not be on the side of anyone who wants to trade freely with India? That's where I would want to be. Free commerce should be the number one thing with India, and I think that the general geopolitical position of neutrality is the way to proceed.
Okay, let me also go across to Michael Kugelman, South Asia columnist, who joins us on the broadcast as well. Mr. Kugelman, how much of this is about tariffs and trade deficits, and how much is it tied to India's relationship with Russia?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. I do think that we're seeing the president injecting geopolitics into his decisions about trade and tariffs. President Trump is much more a hard line now than he was in his first term when it comes to his willingness to apply as much pressure as possible on other countries to try to get them to better help and advance U.S. economic interests. I think that's why, it's one reason why he is willing to apply these tariffs on India. President Trump has long been concerned about what he describes as India's very high tariffs. He's long described India as a tariff king. And India does have tariffs that, from a U.S. perspective, would be seen as high, not as high as some of its closest allies and partners, but still high. So I do think that, there is that dimension to it. But I do think that geopolitics are really impacting the president's thinking in a big way. The president really wants to see Russia agree to a ceasefire in its war in Ukraine. It's very unhappy that it has not been willing to do so. And so I think that President Trump is essentially trying to pressure Russia by pressuring India. He's trying to convince India, a close trade partner and a close partner on the whole with Russia, to essentially distance itself from Russia in the hopes that that would compel Russia to stop fighting its war in Ukraine. So unfortunately, I do think this is a case where India is getting dragged into these concerns that President Trump is having about Russia, his frustration about Russia's unwillingness to this point to stop fighting in Ukraine.
Mr. Kugelman, historically, has the United States backed down from a similar tariff stances when they were met with coordinated pushback, for example, via the WTO or coalitions like Brics? Do you see that happening?
It does seem that President Trump is very defiant and that he is not inclined to pull back from his decision to apply these tariffs. But that said, it is absolutely true that we could see a change. I mean, President Trump himself has tended to be someone who changes his mind quite frequently. I mean, if we just go back a bit earlier this year, soon after he announced the initial reciprocal tariffs on many countries, including India, he announced that there would be a pause. So I do think that we should see these tariffs as a pressure tactic, and that he hopes that by announcing these very high tariffs, that it will compel countries that are victimized by them, including India, to make concessions and do things that would ease President Trump's concerns about how these countries impact U.S. economic interests. But that said, India has clearly already made a lot of concessions to the U.S. Earlier this year, it reduced some key tariffs on goods that related to the U.S. So it's hard to say. And President Trump is very unpredictable, so it's very difficult to predict what exactly could come next. But at least at this point, he appears to be unwilling to back down with these tariffs.
Okay, finally, the coming together of the BRICS nations, what does that mean in the larger context?
I think that the danger for President Trump is that the very outcomes that he most wishes to avoid could actually come into play. Clearly, President Trump is unhappy with BRICS. He thinks that it represents an effort to create alternative economic models that would go against the U.S. dollar. And I would argue that to this point, those efforts have been unsuccessful. BRICS has been unable to create a BRICS bank. But by alienating all of these countries in BRICS, or should I say by upsetting all of these countries in BRICS by slapping these high tariffs on them, I would argue that the BRICS states now have a stronger incentive to try to push forward and develop some type of model that would shield them from U.S. tariffs, that would avoid the U.S. dollar, and that even though they had previously been unwilling to take such steps because of their dependence on the U.S. dollar, given how serious the situation has become, I would argue that there might be a stronger motivation on the BRICS states to put together these alternative mechanisms, these alternative economic mechanisms that would compete with the dollar. That's the very outcome that President Trump would most like to avoid.
All right, let me quickly go across to Mr. Mark Linscott as well, the Senior Advisor, U.S. India Strategic Ties Forum, and he has been listening to us very patiently. Mr. Linscott, I want to understand the U.S. position. From your perspective, what are the underlying strategic motives behind President Trump's refusal to resume any sort of trade talks with India at this moment?
Well, In fact, I am not aware of a definitive, a clear refusal to engage in further trade talks. I mean, it's clear that the president thrives on chaos and uncertainty. He's pulling out all the stops to leverage, to squeeze, to even bully to address his objectives, which I think are twofold. The one that has emerged so suddenly is Indian purchases of Russian oil and his efforts to resolve the Russian-Ukraine conflict. But the longer-term one, or the one that's been on our minds for the last few months, is the effort on trade and to reach at least an interim agreement on trade. So I hope that those doors are still open for further negotiations, and I think they may be.
Okay. So how do you think the United States perceives the growing coordination within the BRICS nation? Could a deeper India, Brazil, China, Russia economic cooperation escalate tensions with Washington, or do you think it can also serve as a leverage in negotiations?
Yeah, it's a bit of an ironic situation. I've long been a skeptic of the ability of those nations to be able to align, coordinate, cooperate on trade. The interests are just so different in many respects. I mean, certainly with China and India, and even on agriculture between Brazil and India, there are some significant differences in approaches to trade. So I've been a skeptic. It's clear that there is more discussion among the BRICS nations to work more on trade, particularly given the threats from the Trump administration. But I don't think that's going to proceed very quickly. On the other hand, the president reacts immediately and aggressively and very provocatively with new threats of new tariffs associated with any discussions among the BRICS to coordinate more closely and to respond to the threats from Trump. So we have this situation in which perhaps the threat really is not that substantial, that significant or imminent, yet the response is very aggressive.
Okay, Mr. Linscott, let's also talk about the long-term trade strategy here. How should India balance its strategic autonomy, for example, its ties with Russia, with the commercial necessity of maintaining strong U.S. market access as well?
Yeah, it's a very difficult balancing act, and I think it's going to remain a balancing act. India, for years, has emphasized its approach as being strategic autonomy. It's a sovereign nation. It's in a very different place in the world and in the United States. Its geopolitical situation is different than that of the United States or even the Europeans for that matter. Yet, the United States market is hugely important. It's nearly 20% of India's exports. There would be significant economic pain if that market were to be closed off. And I want to emphasize the United States has strong interests, or should have strong interests, in maintaining this relationship as well, both from a strategic and an economic standpoint. That the Indian market at 1.4 billion is just too large to ignore. Last week I was with U.S. agricultural producers, and they see the Indian market as critical for them in the future. So there is that interest on the United States as well. We're just not hearing it from the Trump administration at this point in time.
Okay, so in your view, what should India's, say for example, top 3 trade diversification priorities be in order to reduce this over-reliance on the US market?
Yes, I think that makes sense. And in fact, it's been clear for some years now that India has been focused on diversifying its trade, certainly negotiating free trade agreements with a broader number of trading partners, including developed country trading partners. It was a real accomplishment to conclude the free trade agreement with India, which has now been concluded. So, I think that is an effort that's been ongoing and one that should continue. I don't think it's unique to India, however. I think that, all nations are interested in ensuring that they have strategic trade, that they are trading with trusted partners. Unfortunately, we have a situation now with the Trump administration that it's hard to continue that trust, that to maintain that access to the U.S. market, particularly given the fact that the president can change course at any moment. Tariffs go up. They don't seem to be going down at this point in time, but they go up. New tariffs are applied. So it's becoming, I think, more difficult to maintain that access to the U.S. market, but it remains essential. I mean, I don't think India can do as well as it's been doing economically without continuing access to the U.S. market. Perhaps over the long term, it could diversify out of the U.S. market, but not anytime soon. And I don't think it would be desirable for both countries.
All right, Mark Linscott, Michael Kugelman, Professor Steve Hanke, and Robert Moran, thank you very much for speaking to NDTV, for sharing your views. And it is going to be quite interesting to see how things unfold from here.